All right. Good evening, everyone. My apologies for the slight delay. We haven't done one of these programs in a while, so there was a class in here a little later than we anticipated. So thank you for your patience. My name is Arif Khan. I'm the director of the UNM Art Museum. And before I begin with my remarks, I would like to acknowledge that this program is taking place on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico. Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. The UNM Art Museum gratefully recognizes our history. All right. Hello again, everyone. Well, this is our first in-person program since February 20th, 2020. So if I'm a little rusty, forgive me. My hair is also grayer than the last time we did one of these. So, but one of the lessons we learned during our extended closure is how we can reach our audiences online. So we are streaming this talk and conversation via Zoom. It'll also be made available recorded. So everyone who is out there from afar, thank you for joining us as well. Compared to other museums in the state, because of campus closures, we were completely closed to the public until this past August. But we kept ourselves busy during that time. We produced 5 virtual exhibitions. We financed and collaborated with 3 UNM graduate students to produce There Must Be Other Names for the River, a web-based sound installation and virtual community space centering the Rio Grande River. We produced the Raymond Johnson web portal that made available online for the first time the artist's archival materials that we hold at the museum. We produced the custom design artist-student online engagement platform UNMAM.art with artist Rose Simpson, titled Rose Simpson Seminar. This tool will allow the museum to connect UNM students with artists around the world without having them to physically come to campus. We also held a series of Zoom lectures and panel talks, some of which were organized by our student advisory board, that remained engaged with the museum during our extended closure. All of these programs that I mentioned, they're available on our website for you to enjoy at your leisure. I cannot thank the museum's full-time and student staff for all of their dedicated work over the past 2 years, filled with such uncertainty and stress. Thank you so much, all of you guys who are here. So. I would also like to thank, we're in the Pais building. This is a new building that was supposed to open a while ago and hasn't. So I'd like to thank our neighbors here for hosting in this wonderful facility, specifically Julie Morrison in Physics and Astronomy, who coordinated the use of the space. Also like to thank the Academic Technologies Unit, Tim Johnson and Christian Gonzalez, who helped us learn how to use all of this wonderful built-in equipment that Devin is doing a good job of using. Support for this program is generously provided by the Eileen H. and Walter P. Cleveno Lecture Series Fund, which they established in 2008 and have continued to contribute to. They could not attend tonight, but they will be watching the recorded version when we send it to them. So thank you, Eileen and Walter, for your continued support of the UNM Art Museum. I first had the pleasure of meeting Anila Agha in 2015 when I was living in West Virginia and my partner Megan Schultz organized an exhibition of her work at Marshall University. And I've wanted to work with her ever since then. I'm so glad we were finally able to. The exhibition we have on view at the UNM Art Museum, which will be open till 8:30 after the talk, so if you haven't seen it, you can go and check it out. We were supposed to have the exhibition last year. Thank you, Anila, for being able to reschedule your busy, hectic exhibition schedule and allowing this to happen. And also thank you to our curator, Mary Statzer, for her thoughtful presentation and writing in the gallery guide, which I hope you all got a copy of when you walked in. Please join me in welcoming Anila Quayyum Agha and Mary Statzer.
This is so exciting. People in an audience. I'm beside myself.
And so many faces, my goodness. It's like in real life.
Yeah, right? Thank you so much for coming. It's a thrill to see you all here. And Anila, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you
My
so
pleasure.
much
Thank you.
for your work, for coming, for giving so much of your time and energy to this exhibition.
I am so grateful to both you and Arif, and Megan, of course, for introducing me to Arif, and all of you for coming out. I mean, this is such a pleasure to actually see people in person. Yeah, without a mask. See, I'm not wearing a mask.
Okay, thank you. We'll see what we can do to address it. I'm going to go ahead and start with the introduction. Of course, it's my pleasure to introduce Anila, who was born in Lahore, Pakistan, and received her BFA from the National College of Arts in Lahore, and her MFA from the University of North Texas. Anila has had many solo shows here and abroad, including at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, the National Sculpture Museum in Spain, the Dallas Contemporary Art Museum, the Cincinnati Art Museum. Oh my gosh, I think I better stop or we'll be sitting here all night. Most recently in 2021, she had solo exhibitions at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, and the Julie Collins Smith Museum at Auburn University. In addition to our exhibition, she currently has one at the Columbia Museum of Art in South Carolina. Her list of group exhibitions is too long to read here, but include a collateral event for the 2019 Venice Biennale titled She Persists, which included 22 contemporary feminist artists. Anila is represented by two galleries, Sandram Tagore in New York City and Tally Dunn Gallery in Dallas. Her works are in numerous museum, public, and private collections in the US and abroad. She has been a professor in drawing at the Heron School in Indianapolis since 2007, and she is currently the Morris Eminent Scholar in Art at Augusta University in Georgia. Anila was awarded the Ephraimson Fellowship from the Cincinnati Museum, the Sheila Prize, the Dahan Artist of Distinction Award, and in 2014, the fantastic activated sculpture Intersections, which is on view in our museum right now, won Art Prize in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And if you don't know about Art Prize, I suggest you look it up. It's a very exciting event. And Anila has the distinction of winning both the popular vote and the juried vote, a testament to the power of your work for both critics and the public alike.
Thank you.
This summer, Anila will be in Washington, D.C. doing research as a prestigious Smithsonian Fellow in the Arts. So please give a warm welcome to Anila one more time, and then we'll be off and running. Okay. So Anila, it's so exciting for you to finally be here. We organized this exhibition over a couple of years, and mostly on Zoom and email. I had one quick visit to Indianapolis, but it's just, I've had all these questions bottling up for the last 2 years, so it's just great to have you. So let's start a little bit by talking about your life. Where did you grow up? Did you grow up with art? How did you become an artist?
So I grew up in a country where art wasn't considered very high on the food chain.
Okay.
So it was. It took some convincing to convince my parents that I wanted to go to art school. There was only one art school in the entire country at the time, and it had been set up by the British colonial, Pakistan was colonialized for a long time. And so it used to be called the Mayo School of Art, named after one of the people who took care of the country, I suppose. And then it changed to the National College of Arts, and I remember so prior to joining, I remember I used to go to boarding school. My parents sent us to boarding school. Mm-hmm. And there I remember doing watercolor for my art class, and my teacher looked at it, then she looked up at me and she said, "I think you're going to be an artist." Oh. And I was, I think, maybe 8 at the time. Mm-hmm. And being a young person, I don't think I understood what she meant or what she was implying, but it sat in my head, and I think that it sort of percolated for a long time. And so when I was 16, I decided that I wanted to go to art school. And there was only one art school in Lahore, and many people would come from all over the nation to go to that school, and they would only take 100 students a year. And so it was like intense. I sat an English test, a drawing test, and an interview. You couldn't just get in for free. It wasn't gonna happen. And I think I had this very blasé attitude. I said, I'm gonna get in, I don't care how, I'm gonna do this. And I took a rickshaw alone for the first time in my life, and my sister gave me 20 rupees, which is worth maybe $1 here, maybe even less, like 50 cents now. And that's how I went for my interview and everything. And it was exciting. It was my first time to be alone.
Did your family visit museums? Was it something that was part of your...
No. Yeah. There are no, or back then when I was growing up, there was only one museum, and that was attached, well, it was located right next to the art school and across from the university. So all the college, the college, art college, the university was across from each other, and there was the museum, the only museum in the country as well. And we had access to it, but it had a lot of stuff from the Indus Valley civilization, Islamic art, fragments of buildings, tile work, Nabatean stuff. And so there was some really interesting stuff, but no contemporary art there.
Okay, yeah. So when did you get aware of contemporary art? How did that come about? Did you see magazines? What was that process like?
Well, because that teacher, when I was so young, told me that the art will, she said an artist is an important person because she said that you will be one. And I thought of myself as not a second-class citizen, meaning a woman, gendered. I thought, like, that's my goal, and I'm gonna get there, regardless of what other people say. And so I don't know how some people have that grit. I suppose, like, I, very young age, knew that I had a focus and I wanted to do it, irrespective of whether I had money to go to school or not. I worked throughout my undergrad to pay for my college. But my father was an engineer, and in his spare time, he would design homes for people.
Okay.
So he would do architectural drawings for his friends for free. It would have been very helpful if he had gotten paid, because we would have been better off.
But he was drawing, and
so he would draw. And my mother had very good facility with graphite pencils. She would draw birds for us to entertain us. So both of them had facility. I don't think they were ever made to consider that they could be artists.
Yeah. So that teacher planting that seed was really key.
Yeah, very key.
Oh. So around 2000, you moved to the United States, where you did your MFA. And you've often talked about moving to the US and your feelings about being an immigrant to this country. Could you talk a little bit about how that fact of your life has shown up in your work? What would you like viewers to understand about your own immigrant experience, and more generally about immigrant experience in general? Is that, you've talked freely about that, both sort of in casual conversation with us, but also I've seen you, say things about it in interviews more formally. So could you just speak to that a little bit about, first, how it shows up in the work, perhaps, if it does?
I wonder if I could go back and first address what it feels like to be an immigrant, and then I can address how it shows up in my work. Sure. For my first, when I arrived into the US, my husband got a job. I was married, and we ended up in Dallas, Texas. Then 9/11 happened, and I discovered that I was brown. I hadn't discovered that before that, because people were very nice, and it was, to to tell you honestly, in Pakistan, I'd gotten really bored. I needed a new challenge. And so when my husband of that time suggested we move here, I was all, like, let's go, new challenge. And so the first few years in Texas were pretty hard because I was unable to make friends. And it seemed like it would continue. And so that made me think of going back to school. And the reason why I decided that was not because I always wanted to be educated, because that's something that Pakistanis are taught to think of when they're very young, that you can only rise if you're educated and highly educated at that. Like master's is just the minimum.
Gotcha.
And so that was one of the goals anyway. But the idea of going to school, I thought, would help with networking. It would allow me to open my mind and understand the culture that I'm part of now. But the sense of displacement, the sense of loss, kind of continues with you forever, because you have lost your country. So that means that you have lost your identity and you have to recreate it. And in the process of recreating it, I think I had a lot of help because I had my professors. And I remember one of my professors actually pulled me into her office and asked if anybody had kind of been derogatory towards me after 9/11, which was really generous of her, and I appreciate that forever. But there were other things that one had to deal with. My son often had to face the brunt of it because his name is Rafe, and he was sometimes teased by his classmates by the name Rafe bin Laden. And that's not my name, so it was very offensive. But I think having those experiences, and then also realizing that in Pakistan, I was a gendered person, and public space was not for women. So putting those two ideas together and thinking about the circumstance that makes somebody exclusive or inclusive, or is part of the golden circle or not, made me realize that that's the work I want to do. I want to make sure that my work is available to people so that they can understand what it feels to be excluded and included. And I think that really is what I try to do through my work, to kind of show that everybody has value, including refugees or immigrants, and we bring value to a new culture, even though I think forever you would be an outsider, because you're kind of a displaced person. And being a displaced person is not so bad, really, because you're an observer. And so you observe culture and the norms, or what's commonplace, or what's important, and you realize, and I think over the years I've learned a lot about the American culture, but I've learned a lot about myself also, because I was born and raised there in Pakistan. And so being able to compare and contrast, I am able to make work that allows me to address those issues that I faced as an immigrant here. And just to preface all this with, I was not somebody who came here as a refugee, or so imagine if I'd come here as a refugee. That's even worse. To find that you have no agency anymore would be just enormously trying. I came here with choice. And so that also changed the paradigm for me. I was accepted initially, and then 9/11 happened, which changed everything. The social landscape changed. And so I think that's how I reflected in my work. Secondly, I think I experienced this one particular thing, which I don't know if other people have faced it, but often people didn't know where I came from or what my country is all about. In America, I think there was limited knowledge of Asian politics and how colonization happened around the world through different European countries. And India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka were like a singular country. It was as big as the US, or maybe bigger, maybe combined Canada and US. And then to lose that identity. So two things happened. There's an amnesia in Pakistan where we negate our joint history with India, but we talk about the Brits, which is really interesting. And people try to find a way back to the Arabs who came through trade to the subcontinent. And so that's a really odd way to think of history, because our history is really intrinsically tied with Indians. We speak a singular language where we call it Urdu and Hindi. And so that's an interesting thing to also realize. And so I, being here, I speak English, Urdu, and Hindi, and am able to navigate myself through that, convoluted history. And realizing that people had no knowledge of it here in the US. So I think that became one of my reasons to also make my identity known to people around me and explain where I come from, because often I was told, well, don't make art like that, make it like that. Euro-Western is better. And
in
I'm
school
like,
that you're talking about, like in grad
yeah.
school, you had that kind of direction?
Yeah, and it was often sort of maybe not pushed on you, but suggested to you strongly. Well, look at so-and-so or so-and-so. And of course that helps, because art history for art students, if any of them are here, art history and putting yourself in context is really, really important. So I read a lot. I became familiar with Euro-Western history really deeply, but I also had historical stuff from that part of the world, which adds value to the work that I'm doing now, I think. And so I'm also, in a sense, creating identification. I used to think I had a very small voice, but it's becoming amplified, and that helps a lot too.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about some things about place that I wanted to get to in the next question. A few weeks ago, GGU, UNM Art Ed faculty brought her students from a seminar titled Places in Pedagogy to see the exhibition, and we had a wonderful discussion. If any of the students or GGU is in the audience, thank you again for coming and bringing such rich ideas to the show. But yeah, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what your connection with place and what is your connection to place, and what inspiration do you take from place? What is the meaning of place to you, sort of geographically, culturally, politically? How is it tied to your identity? And again, like maybe circle back to the work. If you maybe pick one of the pieces from the show to sort of talk about that with, if you could.
So if you think about it, everybody has a name, right? And that's how you're identified. Every time you travel, you have to show your ID. So place is very much about your ID. It's your identity. And when you lose that place, you become definitely footloose and fancy-free, but it's also a loss of your identity.
Right.
And I think that can cause a lot of pressure on you, on an individual, I think, because it will make you think where you belong, how you belong. And I think first set of immigrants may not feel it, but their children would definitely feel it, because then they go back to visit so that they can identify where they originally came from. And so identity and place are very interconnected, I think. They add value to you, they add a sense of belonging, a sense of preserving your past, a sense of preserving your future. And so place, I think, is integral to the human condition, I think. But so many of us are displaced, and we, in the US, we voluntarily move around.
Right.
And I know that many people travel hundreds of miles to visit their families at Easter or Thanksgiving or Christmas because their place is somewhere else, but they're working somewhere else. And that's a concept that makes, it, a sense of loss is kind of connected to you when you lose that sense of place. And I think to use patterns or imagery that connects me to my original place of starting out is extremely important to me because it allows me to identify where I started from and where I am now. And so I'm kind of creating the dots to connect. And I think that's how I would explain my use of pattern, my use of the cube, the geometry. So it's evident in the work, I think.
For sure.
Would you agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. Pattern, of course, is very important. Color is very important. Light and shadow is very important. I'd like to talk about light and shadow and how you use those elements to create a sense of place or mood, or just how you use light and shadow as sources of content and meaning. Can you speak to that, please?
It's a loaded question.
I know,
right?
I know. These are all pretty full, but you're doing great, so I'm going to keep at it.
So light and shadow is something that I was very familiar with from a very early age. If some of you may be familiar with the Mughal dynasty that came from Turkey into the subcontinent, and they conquered the land and started creating these amazing architectural edifices that still exist. So they were medieval, but they still have survived. And because of the climate in the Middle East and South Asia, they had one particular thing that they invented, which was very interesting because it had perforations in it. So, and they are called jalis, but in the Middle East, they are called mashrabiyas. And what it allowed to happen in the architecture, because the walls were at least 2 feet thick, to make the environments cool. But then they also became very dark because the windows were tiny. And so they would have these jalis put in place that allowed the air to travel, but also the light to come into the dark spaces inside. And women lived on the inside and men lived on the outside. And that was something that happened a lot in the subcontinent, I think also in the Middle East. And so I spent a lot of time in these places because when visitors came from abroad, we would take them to these locations. And then when I became an art student, I would go there with my group of students, or I'd go there alone with my sisters. And it was a place, so there was this one particular place in Lahore, the river Ravi went through or around the city of Lahore, and then it changed course. And this tomb, it's called the Jahangir's tomb, and it's like an upside down tabletop, but it had these beautiful tiles and patterns on it. So when the river changed course, it left that place hidden and became very historical, but almost nobody went there, except maybe me and a few others. And you could hear the sound of birds, and you could hear the silence. And I would spend a lot of time there. I remember when I'd go back to visit, I often asked my sisters to go back with me to that location. And there were jalis, and I've discovered artisans trying to renovate and preserve the buildings, and it was all carved in marble with inlays, semi-precious stones, colorful tiles, and I just loved being there. And so I think that's where I discovered the light and shadow. And then when I moved to the US, and I started grad school, I started working with cutouts, and I was already cutting them out, but I would create stitch work around the edges of the cut work.
Some of that was shown on the screen, right?
Oh.
There were, not right now, but there was an image, yeah.
So I would create these circles, and then I would cut them out, and sometimes I'd fill them with painted pieces that I'd paint myself, and I'd wax them so they were translucent and the light would travel in. And so that was the second thing. And then the third thing that happened that brought it all together for me was that I became a professor at Heron, and then Indiana University had this funding available for professors to travel overseas. And so I wrote a grant and I went to Spain, and I visited the Alhambra in Granada, southern Spain, which was ruled by the Moors or the Arabs from the Middle East for about 1,000 years. And there I found this beautiful edifice from the past, and it was like I came home to my special place. Mm-hmm. And it was a heaven made of pattern. It surrounded me. It was on the stucco, it was in the ceilings, it was on the wooden panels of the doors, it was carving, it was tile work, it was water, reflection, screens. And I thought, my God, I'm either high or this is like an amazing place. And so that made me think of a few things when I was there. I saw people walking around, and there were thousands of people. And it was a timed visit. You could only be in one section of that building. It's a World Heritage Site.
Yeah.
And so people had to move slowly but surely through, and you had 2 hours. And I remember I looked around and I looked at the faces of people around me, and they all were talking in whispers. Can you imagine this beautiful building and nobody's talking loudly and no children are running around? Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just like, and the people had a look of awe on their faces. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, I want to do that. And so I came home, I started cutting paper, and I'm like holding it up and looking at it. And suddenly I noticed light filtering through it because I had a light above my head. And I said, my God, what the have I been doing? I should be doing that. And so that made me write a grant. I got a lot of money from the university. And so that's where the journey for the cube started. Mm-hmm. And at the time I was thinking about the cube, and I thought, you know, it also references Islam. Mm-hmm. And I'm not religious, but I was like, inspired by the idea of critiquing religion, monotheistic religion, because I thought, like, you know, half of the world's population is in chains much of the time. You know, they are without agency, especially in South Asia. A lot of women are without agency, and I felt like it was a good way to critique it, make a feminine space out of a cube. Mm-hmm. So there.
Several UNM classes are investigating light and shadow as a material. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about, well, maybe not so much material, but how, I'm interested in your process. I've had a lot of questions about your process, and how do you just described, you know, how intersections, which is this piece she was just speaking about, that's the one. Could you talk a little bit about something as practical as, you know, research and development, and, you know, are you constantly looking for light sources that do something with the work? Are you, I mean, this is laser cut steel. Was there a process of sort of arriving at what you wanted to get out of that material, and in that process? Could you just speak a little bit to process?
Well, you know, when I conceived of the idea, I was planning to work with a fabricator. And my boyfriend of the time, who also eventually became my husband, and he fabricates much of the sculptural work, he was on a visit to Indianapolis, and I'm like describing this grand idea I have, and I'm going to build this, and I'm going to give it to so-and-so, and I'm going to work with this person. And he said, hey, look at me. I'm sitting right here. I can build this for you, and we can build it together. And I hadn't worked with him in the past, although he'd asked numerous times if he could, expedite my process. So that was the first time I really collaborated with another human being in that way. And it was like a wonderful summer. We worked together the entire summer because during the semester, I obviously had too much teaching duties to really concentrate on it. But what I did was I had taken thousands of photos while I was at the Alhambra. And so I sifted through them and I looked and I found so like, I think what I need to explain, and I don't know if I'm doing a good job of it, is that, I'm no longer just from Pakistan. I'm also from the US. Mm-hmm. So my design sensibility has progressed to a different paradigm. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that, it's also this. And I need to find a contrast and some commonalities to create the design work. And so building it together, I was obviously referencing architecture from the past, but I also needed to make it modern and contemporary. And so that was the challenge. And I read a number of books about the Alhambra, and I looked at a lot of Islamic art buildings, and I went to the Metropolitan, and I looked at a number of different artifacts in Dallas. And so there was a lot of kind of influence that was flowing into my head.
From American institutions, actually. So what's available here? And there's a whole backstory to all of that, what ends up in these museums, right?
And that also kind of puts you in a voyeuristic position. So I'm like looking at my stuff through different eyes, or not mine as in me, but my cultural stuff through Americanized eyes. And I think that that's an interesting point of view.
Yeah, very.
And so I was able to sort of do that research and kind of combine and then come up with, so much of the work in the intersection, the first piece was from the Alhambra and the photographs I'd taken. And I appropriated those photographs or the architecture from there, and I selected bits and pieces and put it all together myself. Mm-hmm. And I would photocopy tons of different sizes. I would put them together. I would draw them again. I'd stitch them together.
Very
I'd
collage.
tape. Yeah, collage
oriented.
was exactly. And I work in the collage methodology. And so once I did that, I handed it over to Steve, who did the technical drawings, and voila.
I'm not sure Steve would say voila, but because I actually talked to him about it. But yeah, but you hand it over to him, and then he works with the craftsmen that do the.
Well, we built it ourselves in the studio, and so.
What do you mean when you built what?
So my house in Indianapolis had a garage at the back, which was a 2-car garage. And I'd converted it into a studio. And so with the grant money, I bought a laser machine, which was tiny. It had a 22-inch bed wide and about 14 inches deep. But we took the back off, and so we could slide a panel into it and do it 3 times. So we would cut one section, and we had figured out a way to attach the second section. So it was like a screen print where the registration marks worked, panel by panel. And so there are 8 panels in the original piece, and it's made out of particle wood. Okay. And so we did it all in-house. And then we put a rib on the inside. Most of the work was, of course, done by Steve. And I was more his understudy at that point in time. And so, and then we would, the laser machine wouldn't go through all the particle wood. It wouldn't go all through. So I sat then, cut pieces and took out the excess baggage that was,
the pieces that didn't come all the way out.
And then we would take it outside to the backyard, and we put down a foam core like the building material, and we built it on top of that.
Okay.
And then at night, we would take it apart and put it back inside.
Okay.
And that's how we built the first piece.
Okay.
It was too big to build inside the room.
Okay. So no maquettes, I'm hearing. Just
No, there's a maquette
Yeah?
too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's hanging in my Augusta house.
Okay.
Yeah. It was a 2-foot piece that we first built. And we put it on a corner first. And I didn't like it that way. But, I think it has value because it taught me so much about the 3-dimensional space. We put a light in it, and it was like, wow, this is like just amazing.
Yeah.
We're going to do this. And, it was all very exciting at that time.
Yeah, well, it was exciting to us and the museum staff when first you selected custom colors for this exhibition, and that was very exciting to see it go up. And then the moment where the piece was put together, I see some people that that worked on the show in our audience, and it was amazing to see it come together, and then to turn the light on and just watch it light up the space was very beautiful, and to see what it did to the color of the paint, it's very complex and very it fills the space in a way that is completely unexpected. It's so simple. One light source doing
But
an
don't
amazing
you-
amount of things.
I wonder if you ever consider this, that sometimes the simplest items put together in an elegant, soft, central way. I mean, I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but simple elegance can work wonders, whereas too much complication just complicates it
Right.
overly. So we needed to edit and bring it down to just the essential intrinsic value of that object.
Yeah.
And that's what we were able to do because it was just such a simple cube with a light in it, and that's it. And so yes, it's a very simple object, but it has so much complexity. It has layers upon layers of historical context as well as meaning that I'm able to convey to it because I'm a woman making an object that's gendered in that respect. It's heavy. It's really heavy, yet it feels so light that it's levitating almost without any aid, it looks like. But, of course, there's
Engineering
cables
involved.
holding it. And it turns the gallery space into the art itself.
Yeah.
And the people within it become so valuable because they're moving, and yet they are also art because they are part of the object now.
Yeah.
And so I think the complexity in it is as much as you want to see it, or as little as you want to see it, I think.
I can't add anything to that elegant description. I'm going to leave it there. You once expressed frustration to me that critics focus on the beauty in your work and that critical writing is hard to come by. And you're not the first artist to say this to me. And I always take it as personal, get on it, Mary. Do some good critical writing. But I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about how you think about art and beauty. And, are you playing with using beauty to talk about difficult subjects, maybe? Or maybe we could also talk about awe in this sort of section of the conversation. Intersections, to me, is a combination of beauty, lush color, elegant, ornate patterning, combined with scale that results in something that's truly awesome, in the real sense of the word, not in the popular sense of the word. But yeah, beauty, awe, those sort of things. Can you talk about, you just have a show called Beautiful Despair. So do you have thoughts on beauty that you could share with us and maybe how it plays out in your work or how you want to play it out in your work in future projects?
I wonder if you read Dave Hickey's, I can't remember the book that's got he is credited with this quote where he said, I mean, I don't remember it, the exact words, but the essence was that why make art if you don't want people to experience the beautiful in it, or something like that.
Okay.
And I often think about what he may have been talking about, because he's like talking about what's the point of humanity making art if you don't want to be surrounded by beauty? Or, you know, you make these cities that are so clean and the roads are so nice and the houses look pretty, but you don't want to see beautiful art, you know? And beautiful art in the case of when it's referencing difficult subjects like race and color and sexuality and religious affiliations, or just the difficulty of being human and being undervalued, you know, because you have a tendency to be a particular creed or a particular color or a particular nationality. I mean, all of those subjects are so difficult to talk about. People get defensive when you bring them up. How do you approach those subjects unless you can do it in a manner that makes people feel comfortable? And I have learned in my long career of teaching in this country that difficult subjects can be approached with a softness that doesn't turn people into defensive.
Or shut people down.
Yeah. And so I, you know, obviously come from a country where women are considered ornaments as well. And that's integral to the way of like what beauty means and how it undervalues somebody's mental abilities versus physical abilities. And so beauty over there means something completely different. And then if you go to Japan, it means something completely different. So different parts of the world have considered the beautiful as being complicated. And when I started working, my professors and my colleagues, classmates would often talk about how good as a craftsperson I am. And I made beautiful things. And I'm like thinking, what's so bad about that? But I realized that, of course, there has to be a slight edge to something, anything, to make it really stand out. And so I think the way I view beautiful in my work is all about creating a knife edge.
A knife edge?
So you can walk on that edge. You're like, you know, you're kind of talking about difficult subjects, yet you're doing it in an environment that makes you feel soothed. It makes you want to have, you know, you're looking around yourself and you're thinking, oh my God, this is beautiful. And so you are allowing yourself to calm down. You're allowing yourself to talk to a stranger, because that stranger doesn't look brown or black or green or yellow or purple or whatever. But they look like human beings. So I think it camouflages people into thinking that it's okay to approach a complete stranger. And it also allows you to have intimate moments with yourself. So there's intimacy if you want to have it, and there's community if you want to have that. And I think that's what I love about the work that can allow you to do that, where you can integrate yourself, experience it, and then walk away and carry it with you. I mean, how else are we going to change the world? Yeah. So.
I have lots of other questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. So are there questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Are there particular traditions in Southern Asian art that particularly inspire you? And a lot of your work looks like, or reminds one of medieval Islamic design especially from Iran. Are you conscious of any of those heritages and intentionally use them?
Well, if you are familiar with the history of Asia, you may realize that there was a lot of migration that happened because the subcontinent was a very fertile basin for cultivation. And people came in from Turkey, from northern Central Asia, and they would come and conquer and leave their imprint there. And much of the buildings were renewed, and then they would be kind of like the Alhambra had a church put in the middle. There's a mosque in one of the cities in southern Spain that has, the red mosque with the tiles and all. That has a church put right in the center of it. I think that's what I was trying to kind of convey through medieval, appropriation. It's also because appropriation requires a certain degree of age to it. Because if I were to appropriate Andy Warhol, there may be a problem there. But I can appropriate images or ideas from ancient stuff that belongs to all of us. So I think it's about like 100 years of having something exist before you can appropriate from it, I think.
Oh,
at least
like public domain?
Yeah, public domain kind of thing. And so, but it's also, it allows me to reference a land that is not familiar to people in the West. And those are icons, like the Taj Mahal is an icon. And so people will be familiar with that kind of thing to be able to see, okay, she's reflecting on this. And I think that's what I try to do. And it's funny that you bring in the Persian aspect. One of my projects, it's titled All the Flowers Are For Me, that was at the Peabody Essex, still is, and is permanent installation there. The working title for it was Persian because I was drawing from the Persian sort of like civilization. But it's also very tightly connected to the subcontinent and Central Asia. And so we have similarities, but there's a particular style from Persia that's not very South Asian. And so I did a combination of that. And when I sent that pattern to be cut to the vendor, 3 weeks passed, and they came back and they said, we still haven't been paid yet. And I wondered, why? What happened? So they said, well, maybe you can call your bank. And so I called my bank, and they said, well, the FBI stopped the payment on it. And I was like, really? Why? Oh, because you had the word Persian on the invoice. And of course, that's the relationship between America and Iran. But I was referencing Persia of yore. And that was a very interesting thing that happened. I was like flabbergasted that that would, so I think they did a background check on me and made sure that I was who I am and I wasn't sending some, quote unquote, dangerous materials.
I love the Steel Garden Red, which is a brand new piece that's debuting here. I love that you've appropriated a flower from William Morris, the British, 19th century British textile designer who himself had borrowed, if to put it politely, from Africa, from the Celts, from the Islamic world himself, and that you reappropriated it, decolonized it, if you will. Yeah. Are there any more questions? Justine?
I wanted to ask you, you talked about length about steel pieces. I'm also interested, you spent a lot of time today with the mysterious inner world. And I think what you're talking about like that knife edge and everything. To me, it comes through the layering. It's the layers that allow you to see some of the different meanings. And that piece just astonished me, the number of layers and the number of things that you can spend time with. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about those pieces in which you do the kind of embroidery and the work. And I'm really curious about the process. I had thought it might be how does that, how do you go in there and cut it by hand, or how is that, or are those lasers cut too, the different layers of stuff?
So let me just interject in case people on the recording couldn't hear the question. The question is about your drawings and the materials that are used to make them, and also the process. And specifically referencing the drawing Mysterious Inner Worlds, which is on, it'll come up again on the screen.
So to answer your question, I think of layers as metaphors for meaning, and how meaning covers place and time and the continuum of time, but also, especially the layers that, and I use laser machine cuts to do the paper cutting, and then I layer them one on top of the other. And the Mylar is really in my mind like marble that I have grown up with in Pakistan, because, you know, because of the heat, a lot of people have marble on the floors, or intarsia, or what was somebody else calling it, like, you know, the crushed marble together. And a lot of floors are made from that. And I find the idea of, when you look at the Taj Mahal, if you've seen or examined it through books, or if you've visited it, it has a lot of marble everywhere, and it's carved, it's inserted, it's inlaid. And I often think of the crushed agency of women, especially in certain, I mean, even in the US, where women are held back. I mean, in the pandemic, during the pandemic, it was mostly women who had to leave jobs to look after families. And so they had a loss of income. And that often happens all around the world, especially in third world countries where economics are even worse. And so I think of them as like headstones for women's dreams. And, you know, so I'm sort of referencing the idea of that. But the Mylar serves another purpose in my mind. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with the word muslin. It was a material that was initiated in Bangladesh, or as it was East Pakistan back in the day. And the muslin that came from there was woven in such a beautiful fashion that you could pass it a whole bale of, you know, like the length of yardage through a ring. It was so fine. And you could pull it through and it would come through. And muslin was often used in curtains to block viewing of women. And I think of the muslin doing, the Mylar doing that task for me. So it hides, yet it reveals. And then I try to make it archival so it doesn't kind of get displaced, or, you know, things may happen. So I stitch it all together so it stays together. So that references my mother's sewing circles that she used to do, and I learned how to stitch by hand. And so, and the beads act like light. So they all have meaning. All the components have particular meanings.
Sure.
So I love that one, really, that's another question I had about something that's the heavy steel, because of the lightness that you did, that you cut out the light itself, there's a sense of veil. But it's good if we have that, it's, you know, put back to the first question, to all of these various layers and veils and themes that you're creating, that connect to that history because of the many different layers of persons, versus, and, you know, that is coming down into
Exactly, yeah. Thank you. You put it really beautifully. But like, if you think of this land and how Arif thanked the native people's ownership of this land. You know, I mean, like, imagine the history that existed prior to people showing up from Europe, and then what happened and transpired over the past many centuries. I think about that. Like if I were to make something that was inspired by, say, New Mexico, I would have to excavate those histories and understand how they work and how the layers happened. It's almost like when you're, as a geologist, you're looking at the layer of stone and how it was formed. We cannot ever say that we did everything. You know, I mean, like you stand shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of centuries of people doing things, and you're just riding on their shoulder every time. And so I often think about that historical, purview, like thinking about like it's not in isolation that I have arrived at this point in time. I'm helped by history, so to speak.
And that's the drawing that we were just discussing. Mysterious Inner Worlds. There was another question.
It's also like a womb,
Is there another question over here? So,
Do you want to repeat?
yeah, so the question is, what kinds of obstacles or hardships have you encountered and had to overcome in order to make your art?
So when I lived in Houston, I taught 10 to 12 classes as an adjunct.
At one
year?
time?
A
year, but still.
It's a
goodness.
lot to prep. And I would drive all around Houston and the burbs, the suburbia, which is really extended. So Houston has such a huge area to cover. And so the gas mileage was enormous. And I made very little money, So I think the first thing I always had to think about was that I had enough rent money saved up to pay the rent so me and my son won't become homeless. And then my entire home used to be a studio space. So he knew not to touch stuff that was like I was working on. But like I'd invite people over, I'd cook for them, and then I'd sit and I'd work on my art while I'm talking to people. And that often happened too. And that was mostly in Houston because I moved from Dallas after I graduated from UNT to Houston for an artist residency. And then I decided to stay there. And it turned out to be like the best decision ever. But the rent money and my son's desire to own shoes by Nike were probably the hardest hardship. He always came home and said, "Mom, why are we so poor? Why can't I buy these pairs of, this particular shoe?" It was like the Air Jordan or something, like very fancy, cost $110. And I said, "Well, we are rich in culture." For a 10-year-old, that doesn't mean anything.
I think we can take one more question, and back in the back there.
I'd love to do that. Are you an architect? Would you like to work with me?
So can you repeat the question?
And my next,
Yeah.
she asked if I could incorporate into permanent installations into architecture. My husband, current husband, often tells me that your next husband is going to be an architect. Yes.
Okay, a couple more.
I have one question. What I'm noticing in your artwork is, I don't know whether I'm seeing it right, is that you are trying to keep a symmetry. At the same time, you're trying to break away from the symmetry into an abstract form. And there are little fragments which are coming out and not conforming to a symmetry. Because most of the Mughal architecture, and which inspired you, like the Taj Mahal, has a lot of detail on symmetry. Symmetry is what everything is based as far as Mughal architecture. But here I see that you have
a outline, a confinement, but inside there is something which wants to break away, keep brackets, and doesn't want to keep that symmetry flowing. And I just wanted to know if you feel that kind of emotion in you that wants to break off from the boundaries of whatever you call it, conservatism or being that way, and try to find new things and get off from that.
Well, life is messy, isn't it? And so it's a metaphor for like how we try to contain the mess
Right.
within our homes or within our cupboards or within our closets or in the
Emotions.
kitchen. Emotions, relationships. But so I like the symmetry and the chaos, and I try to combine them together. And earlier I mentioned that I'm a product of Pakistan and the US now. I'm a sort of like a collaboration of the two. My design sensibility is that. So yes, I'm often trying for abstraction through symmetry and chaos. And so it's a very insightful observation, and thank
What I
you.
wanted to find out is, do you think you will come to a medium where you will find that symmetry and that chaos and confusion can exist peacefully?
I don't know. Ask me when I'm 85 and still living.
Sounds like you're interested in it. I do.
Yeah.
All right, this has to be the very last question. There's, yes, in the white here, please.
Could you speak up a little, please? Well, my first desire is to critique because, you know, I'm a 21st century living artist and I'm making contemporary work, and I see around me a religious dogma often impedes people's progress and community building, and there are so many meanings derived or interpreted that affect people's lives. And maybe in the original text, that may not have been the intention. And so I kind of pay attention to those things where I feel like injustices may be perpetrated on people or minorities or people without agency who kind of think that that's the way the world is. I mean, I don't want to name names, but, you know, I mean, like things have happened in our history, even in the last 2 centuries, where religious figures have done untold damage to young people. There are, you know, all sorts of meanings, like women around the world have been held back because, you know, you are not supposed to go in public space, and, you know, not being able to enjoy a mosque for me because of its beauty, because in a country like Pakistan, a mosque is not just a mosque for prayer, it's a library. It's an art museum because all that beautiful stuff is happening around you and you're not permitted to be in there. And not because of the religious text, but more because of the culture. I mean, that's impeding you. So it's the interpretation that I take exception to. And that's why I make the work that I do, because I think that, you know, circle the Kaaba is like, you know, what does that get you when you at home are treating your wife really badly? Or, you know, if you're going to church every day, how does that help you to commune with God when you may be doing something really awful on the side? And I think that that's the point I'm trying to make, that religion was or is for you to be better, to treat people better, and or even any denizen of this earth to be better, like, you know, animals or people, you know, that come from brown countries. I mean, does it matter? And that's what I mean when I say I want to critique cultural interpretation of religious dogma, because there's this thing where there's this different or distance between meaning and what was intended. It's supposed to make us better, right? Does it? So,
Anila, thank you so much.
my pleasure, and thank you all for listening and not getting upset at me.
Thank you.